Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar. So today we're going to look at what do BizTalk applications look like when migrated to Azure. And this is part 2, where we'll start to look at some of the details of building an application. If you've seen some of the previous webinars, we're building on those. The background being that in June, Microsoft released details of a forthcoming BizTalk Migrator tool that will make the journey of migrating from BizTalk to Azure much simpler, much quicker, much easier. And although we don't have too much details on what that means at the moment, what we're trying to do is just ponder a bit, speculate as to what that might look like in practice. So last webinar we looked at the technology stack on AIS, and what we're going to delve into is in this webinar is the fundamentals of what are some of the details that you've got to get right in your app to start building your BizTalk app on or rebuilding your BizTalk app on Azure, and what we think if we were doing it, what it would look like. So today's webinar, we're in terms of audience, we're expecting you'll be familiar with BizTalk and interested in AIS. You don't need to be a full-on developer on Azure or on AIS, but it's obviously the whole point is that you're here because you're interested in it. If you're very advanced in that, then just treat this as a recap and compare notes with what you do anyway. But we'll talk a little bit about what's come up in the previous Q&A. We're going to look at things like triggers and actions, because those are what make integration apps tick in Azure. We're going to look at a big look at PubSub and messaging, because a lot of what we take for granted in BizTalk is all around PubSub, and so much so that BizTalk makes you do PubSub. You don't get a choice. In Azure you do get a choice, but if you're trying to migrate a BizTalk app and move to an equivalent, then there are lots of options in how you do that kind of message box equivalent, and we'll be talking in a lot of detail about that, because that's really, obviously, the message box is the core of any BizTalk app, and so the replacement in Azure is also going to be very heavily looking at that messaging solution. And then we'll also look at some very simple but example apps and talk a little bit about how those would actually be built in detail, and what some of the differences are, what some of the pitfalls are, what some of the components you're going to want to use. And then we'll do Q&A for this week. So we do love Q&A. We'll talk about that in a second, but please feel free to just pop things in the questions. We'll try to answer them as we go on, and at the very least we'll get to them at the end, and if we can't get to them at the end, then we'll try and get back to you at a later point. So definitely, if anything comes up, do just pop it in the Q&A in the chat. So the presenters today, as per the last webinars, there's myself. I'm Andrew Rivers. I'm a director of 345 Technology. We basically look at data and building your business on data, which starts integration, moves to data platforms, and then data analytics and AI. So that's kind of our piece, is data platforms. And I have with me Dan Probert, who's CTO of Affinus, and Dan is the world leader on logic apps. So need we say more? Moving on, do you want to say hello, Dan?
Hi. World leader on logic apps is perhaps a bit of a stretch, but I know a lot about them.
No, seriously, don't be hard on yourself. It's, so as you'll have seen from previous webinars, Dan's depth of expertise is immense, and we all benefit. We all learn something new from him. So it's brilliant to have Dan here. And presenting this webinar. So
thanks, Andrew.
And together our companies are involved in an initiative called Azure Integration Group, and Azure Integration Group is here to share information and best practice on Microsoft integration, and in particular BizTalk to AIS migration, which is a real kind of problem space. Now, whether you're a BizTalk customer, you'll see that as BizTalk customers, we're here to, we've got an open door. We're happy to share information with you. So, if there's any questions or anything you want, help with, then just get in touch. We'd love to hear from you. And and see if anything that we know can help you do what you need to do. So just treat us as an extra resource that you can call on, and just we're happy to help. Always happy to share a bit of knowledge and learning. And finally, let us do the research. So there was a big announcement on the BizTalk Migrator tool. The BizTalk to Azure migration, and there's a certain amount in the public domain that we've shared already. But if you'd like us to do the research and come across as soon as we come across any more information, then let us know, and we'll add you to the list and just send you information when it comes out. It's going through a bit of a quiet spell at the moment. As I say, there was the June announcement, and then it's gone a bit quiet. But I'm sure that as we get towards the autumn, when this tool is scheduled to be released, there's going to be a lot more information coming out. So just let us do the legwork, and we'll keep you informed. So previous Q&A. There's very briefly, what I want to say on this is that we are compiling a list of all the questions that have been asked previously, and we are about to publish it. It's currently in the editing phase. We will publish the master Q&A list, and we'll have that together soon of all the questions that have been asked and what our answers are. And so we'll send that out as soon as that's ready. We will include any questions from today's webinar, so we'll get those on there as well, and we'll keep that live as we go on into the future. We'll just keep updating that as we carry on. We love the questions and the comments, so keep them coming. That is that's kind of what the most fun part of all this is when we hear from you and you feedback to us what you're interested in, not necessarily what we're just we can't make these as interesting as we can for you if you don't let us know a little bit about what it gives a steer as to what you're doing. So we love to hear about what you're interested in. So what I'll do now is I've talked enough for the moment, but let's just let me hand over to Dan for a little bit, and we'll start walking through a reasonably simple BizTalk application, and then talk a little bit about what that means in terms of Azure. So do you want to take it away, Dan?
Okay. Hi guys, and well, I should say hi everyone, really. Right. So I think today what we want to do is talk a little bit about some sample BizTalk apps and what they might look like when you migrate them to Azure Integration Services. And this would take a lot more than an hour to go through in great depth. So we've got to start somewhere. So we're going to start with a very simple example. I wanted to start with a fairly realistic example. I remember in the early days of Logic Apps announcements, whenever they did sample apps, they were always sort of Twitter. Here I've got a Logic app, and it can either respond to tweets and do sentiment analysis, or it can send out a few tweets, which is really cool stuff. But if I'm sitting here with my enterprise app connecting to enterprise BizTalk application connecting to SAP and Oracle, that's not much help when I'm thinking about how could I take my existing on-prem application and move it to the cloud. So we wanted to start with something that's fairly simple, is a real application, but it's simple enough that we can show how things work. And this is what we've come up with. So in this example BizTalk application, it's effectively a file mover. I know most places I've worked have them. Yep. It's
the classic BizTalk demo, isn't it?
It is the classic BizTalk demo. I'm picking up a file and it's going to appear out somewhere else. But in this case here, we've got a single receive port with a single receive location using the file adapter. We're using a flat file decode pipeline. So it's a custom pipeline, obviously, with a flat file decoder in it, and there's obviously a flat file schema in there. Converting the file to XML format and optionally debatching it. Then we've got a map that is applied at the receive port level. So once we've converted the flat file into XML, we're applying a map to that to transform it into a different XML format. That's being published to the message box. Then we have a single send port that is subscribing to the output of that receive port. that is using the file adapter, the flat file encode pipeline, and another map. So we're transforming it as we pick it up from the message box to a different format. We're then using the custom flat file encode pipeline to convert that back to a flat file, and then we're dropping that on a file location. So you can imagine I might bring in a .text file, convert it to XML, transform it, drop it in the message box, pick it up from the message box, transform it to a different format, convert it to a CSV and drop it back out. That might be an example for this sort of thing. Although I've used the flat file decoder for doing things like, or encoder for talking to MQ, for example, to kicks in an IBM mainframe as well. So it's, you know, there's a lot you can do with a flat file encoder and decoder. And I've never worked, I don't know about you, Andrew, but I've never worked at a BizTalk customer who wasn't using flat files in some format.
Pretty much most of them. Even if it's not their main thing, but pretty much, you know, pretty much most people have a file that is being spat out somewhere by one system and comes in, you know, and you need to load it somewhere else. So it's absolutely a central application integration case. Yeah,
very much so. I mean, in the early days of BizTalk, back in BizTalk 2000, you know, if you were working with mainframes, which is one of the main areas for integration at the time, at least in my experience, yeah, we were working with flat files. That's what we were doing. But even nowadays, if you're working with integrating some legacy systems, often there are existing point-to-point interfaces that use flat files. And so if you're introducing BizTalk in the middle to act as some sort of message bus, the first step is to use those flat files because it's going to be easier to consume those. So I think it's a fairly realistic example.
Yeah. Okay. So should we have a look through then at you know, so that first part is the message box.
Yes. So one of those things,
I think that's where we can start, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So that thing there is that what joins the receive and send port together is the message box, which provides pub sub for us in BizTalk out of the box. So we don't have any other choices. If you wanted to do queue processing, so you drop things on a queue and then read them out, you know, in a FIFO manner, we can't do that easily. You can do it in BizTalk, but there's no queuing technology as such. What we've got is pub sub. When we go to Azure, though, we've got many different options for how we implement pub sub. So the two that are normally used, because they're the ones we get in Azure as default services, or as inbuilt services, is Service Bus and Event Grid. So both Service Bus and Event Grid support pub sub, and they do it in a very similar way. So sorry, they don't do it under the covers in a similar way, but they do it in a similar way from a contextual, you know, looking at it as a conceptual way.
Yeah,
so
and I think that's one of the things that confuses people, isn't it? That they look so similar to use that you kind of think, well, these are the same thing. Yeah. Why have you got different? So it's kind of really useful to point out what the strengths and weaknesses of each option are, and maybe what some of the other options are if you didn't want to use either of these.
Yeah, that's exactly right, because you can use third-party pub sub tools as well, you know, Kafka, RabbitMQ, things like that. These are just the ones that you get in Azure out of the box. But if we look at the two we've got here, both Service Bus and Event Grid have things known as topics and subscriptions. So a topic is something you publish to, and then you have a subscription on that topic. So in Service Bus, your subscription's going to contain a number of rules, and those rules describe which messages in the topic you want to subscribe to. So, for example, you know, when you create a subscription, it's got a default rule with, you create a subscription, it has a default rule where the filter in the rule is 1 = 1, which means I will subscribe to every message that arrives. But you can change that and say, well, I want to subscribe to messages where this particular property in the message is this value, for example. Now, Event Grid is kind of similar. Again, you have topics and subscriptions. So you publish a message to an Event Grid topic, and then you have one or more subscriptions. Definitely from a logic apps point of view, the subscriptions are dynamic. They're created when you enable the logic app, whereas with Service Bus, they always exist. But it's more important to look at the features that are supported in both of these. So, for example, with Service Bus, out of the box, with Service Bus Standard, the max message size is 256 kilobytes. It's actually slightly smaller than that because there's some overheads. If you're using Service Bus Premium, then you get a 1 meg message size. With Event Grid, you get 1 meg out of the box, although that is made up of 16 separate messages, because each event in Event Grid has a maximum size of 64 kilobytes, but you can combine them together in an array to make a single message that's 1 meg and up to 1 meg in size. There's no AMQP or TCP/IP support in Event Grid, but there is in Service Bus, although they both support HTTP. There's the concept of a max topic size in Service Bus. So if I put a lot of messages on a topic, what's the maximum size of that? Event Grid doesn't have an equivalent, at least not that I could find or I've ever hit. In terms of throughput, Event Grid is sort of a lightweight event-driven architecture. It's designed for processing events, the clue's in the name. Whereas Service Bus is more heavier message-based processing. So because of that, the max concurrent connections are different. So with Service Bus, we're talking about 1,000 if you're using HTTP, and it's 5,000 with Event Grid. And then concurrent requests are similar. Maximum number of topics is an interesting one. So you've got 10,000 topics you can have in a Service Bus namespace, but you've only got 100 custom topics you can have in Event Grid. So the numbers keep going down. Some of the important things for us, though, are the fact that, and we'll talk about this in a minute, what these things are. So session support. So sessions allow us to do order delivery and correlation and things like that, convoys. All that is in Service Bus. We don't get session support at the moment in Event Grid. So that means we also don't get order delivery. Delivery patterns as well. So both of them support at least once. So if a problem occurs delivering a message, it will be retried. So you're going to get your message at least once, which means you need to think a little bit about what happens if you get multiple messages and you've already processed one. Yeah. So
yes, so that's the classic kind of you're still back to the classic idempotency problem, exactly. That we've been dealing with since for 20 years, whatever.
Yeah,
still hasn't gone away.
No, you've got to implement something there. Although what's really interesting is Service Bus has some support internally for handling that, because there's also an at most once pattern supported in Service Bus that you don't have in Event Grid. Along with that, we've got duplicate detection, which is how all this works. So Service Bus can detect if you've got more than one message there that's the same. There's also better batch support in Service Bus that you don't have in Event Grid. And then we have dead lettering. So if someone doesn't respond, if a message is published to a topic and no one subscribes to it, you can have that moved to a dead letter queue. Now contrast that to, say, BizTalk, where if I publish a message with no subscribers, an error is, if you're in an orchestration and you publish, you send a message out of your orchestration and you're using direct message box binding, you'll get an error in your orchestration because there's no subscribers. That doesn't tend to happen in Service Bus. You publish it, and if there are no subscribers, then after a certain amount of time, it gets moved to the dead letter queue. So there's quite large differences there in terms of how it works. If you're migrating an existing orchestration-based application from BizTalk, and you're expecting to know if there's a problem because you have an error in your orchestration, maybe someone hasn't enabled a send port or something like that, then with Service Bus, you would have to have a separate subscription on your dead letter queue to know if that was happening. So there's subtle changes here in how we do things, but if you think about it from a concepts point of view, if you think about it from a high level, we've still got very similar functionality. But it can be very difficult to decide which to choose between Event Grid and Service Bus.
Yeah, one of the things that leaps out on this to me is just how, the first thing, anyone that is, you used to BizTalk world, one of the things you'll be looking at with that is that these message sizes look really small. And obviously there's a reason for that, because the way that the underlying cloud architecture works. And I know that Microsoft are talking about certainly increasing the message size to 100 meg for Service Bus, which I don't think is in general release yet. But it's those sizes are small though, so many people are going to say, well, that just doesn't fit my use case.
Very much so. So that's quite a tricky problem, actually. I'm glad you brought that up, because you hit that all the time, especially when we're doing file-based transfers and logic apps. If you're working, say you were working with the file connector, and we'll talk about this when we look at how we might implement this in Logic Apps. But if you're working with a file system connector, it has a maximum file size. I think it's 30 meg at the moment. They change it every now and then. But the file system connector goes over the on-premise data gateway that, again, we'll talk a little bit about. And that uses Service Bus relays. So it's using Service Bus under the covers. And so they get around this by chunking up the message. So you break a file up into smaller pieces, and each one is a message that is connected together.
Yeah, and you make a convoy of it.
You make a convoy of it, yes, all traveling together.
Hey.
And wait for them all to arrive, and you can bind them back together into the file. So it's done seamlessly for you. However, if we were implementing a situation like this where we've already got the file, so we've got a large file, and we want to publish that to Service Bus for subscription to by our send port, then we've got a couple of options, and the most common option is something that's known as the claim check pattern, which again is an enterprise integration pattern. And in fact, I think you can find documentation about this on Microsoft's site. The idea behind that is that you are, if you think about handing in your coat at, you go to a nightclub or something, and or a bar, or busy restaurant, you hand in your coat, and you at the claim check, and you get a tag, yeah, and then later on you will go and claim back your coat. It's like a claim check. So it's a similar sort of thing, that what we do, we receive the message and we offload the message. We put the message somewhere else. So typically in Azure, that's going to be Azure Storage. So we might store the message in an Azure blob. We get a link to that location, the blob storage location. And that's actually what we put in the message. Then when we publish that to Service Bus, we've still got a small message. So we've got a link to the actual content that we want, if you like. And then anyone that wants to use the content, they just retrieve the claim check pattern says, I'm going to claim the content back. So you're asking for the content back from the storage location, and then you go and process it. And that gets around this limitation. That 100 meg size increase for message sizes, Andrew, that you mentioned earlier, which I think it was Matt Farmer might have mentioned at the Integrate conference. I think that only applies to Service Bus Premium, not Standard.
Well, there's got to be a point to buying Premium, hasn't there?
Yeah,
Otherwise, no one would buy it. So yeah, that makes sense. So let's just kind of so let's just run through because you've got some some points here on Service Bus. So let's just make sure we've covered all these off.
Yeah.
So Service Bus. So quickly running through, it's the premium enterprise messaging service. Like we say, it supports queues as well as topics.
Yeah.
Which so queues is just a FIFO. It's literally a queue, whereas a topic is basically so basically, if you have multiple people pulling from a queue, each of those will get, the message will only go to one consumer, whereas a topic, you can have multiple subscribers pulling message off a topic, and they will all get a copy of it. I think that's one of the kind of the big differences between the queues and the topics there. So we talked about supporting millions of messages, Service Bus Relay, and like I say, queues don't support subscriptions, like I just said. And subscriptions have filters, which is basically the way that you say, I'm only interested in messages that fulfill these particular criteria. And this is why this is such an important part of replacing message box, which is kind of the core of what we're talking about. So I'm sort of conscious of the fact we don't want to get, we do want to make sure that we get onto the, a bit more on the app. So topics. So we got a slide here with a picture of how topics work and the way that subscriptions work. So just want to take us a little bit through this one, Dan.
Yeah, I mean, this is fairly simple here. We have a sender or a publisher who's publishing a message to a topic. There are two subscriptions, which are the boxes with the lines in them that look like a little bit like sliced bread. So that one topic has two subscribers, and then our consumers, who are receivers in this diagram here, are both receiving messages from that subscription. So those subscriptions have their own filters. So it could be that a message published to a topic might go to both subscribers. It might go to one subscriber. It might go to neither subscriber. So just showing that that's how it works. It's pub sub in Service Bus is closer to the sort of enterprise integration pattern of pub sub than BizTalk gives you. Yeah. So we don't have the concept of topics in BizTalk because we just have the message box. In effect, we have one topic called the message box.
Yeah. So if you, if you were to look at this, the equivalent thing to this in Kafka, for example, you'd only have one. Effectively one of your sliced bread loaves. You'd only have one loaf, but you'd have multiple receivers looking at that one set of thing because you'd be looking at all the messages. So like I say, the subscriptions mean that you're actually looking at the messages as they come onto the topic, and then you're creating, ultimately a subscription is like an output queue of the one. Very different from how some other messaging bus technologies actually work.
Okay, I've just seen we've got a good question here from Andy Norris. Could we not use a streaming pattern to blob storage and use routing slips? Yes, you could. So streaming is an interesting one, which I was going to talk a little bit about when we look at patterns and things like that. When we look at pipelines and BizTalk. Pipelines and BizTalk, if anyone's ever written either an adapter or a pipeline component, you'll know about streams, that everything is queued together in a pipeline BizTalk. And effectively what happens is that the stream is pulled from the far end, and as it's pulled through, everyone is reading a bit from the stream as it goes, which is why it's generally frowned upon to write a component that reads the entire stream, processes it, and then puts it back on as a whole new stream. Ideally, because that doesn't work with large files. Pipelines and BizTalk, you can work with a file that's 1 gigabyte if you want to, and it will stream it through. In the AIS world, we don't have streaming in the same way. When we're dealing with HTTP there, what we do have is chunking. And what that means that if I'm in a logic app and I'm receiving a large file, it will be chunked to the logic app, but the logic app actions can't, like the next action after the trigger won't execute until all the chunks have been received. But yes, I guess, Andy, you could do a streaming pattern to blob storage. And then a routing sub. I probably need more information about what you mean by there. But if you've got a routing slip, so you can say that I'm either going to the claim check as part of the routing slip, or I'm not, depending on whether or not we have streamed it to storage, then yes, you could. That's definitely another contender for a pattern that you could use. There's multiple ways of implementing this, to tell the truth. I guess that's the plus and the minus of AIS. You've got full choice in what you do, but you've got full choice in what you do, so it's up to you to create it. BizTalk locks us down with what we can and can't do. It provides us so much richness out of the box. But then it also makes us a little bit, I was going to say lazy, but maybe that's pejorative. It means that we we don't have to think about it.
But it's one of those things that BizTalk is a paradigm, isn't it? And then once you start thinking within the product, that's the way it forces you to think in a certain way, and it forces you to work within the constraints of the product. Whereas when we're talking about Azure and AIS, we've got so much more richness in what we can actually achieve.
Exactly. I've got a BizTalk shaped hammer, and everything looks like a nail suddenly. Yeah.
And then now we've got all these other, we've got a bulging tool bag of options now, and that's really what we're working with. Okay, so before I come up with any other analogies, let's just have a look at, because what we really also want to talk about is effectively Service Bus sessions, because this is something that is really, really important for some of the scenarios. So
very much so.
So take it away.
Okay, session support session support wasn't there when Service Bus was first announced, but came, I can't remember, a year or so later. I might have the timings wrong, but it's incredibly important for a lot of scenarios that we would be using. So sessions allow us to do two things. One is correlation, and two is ordered delivery. So we don't have this in Event Grid. So if you want to do ordered delivery, you use Service Bus sessions. So what they do is they allow us to, it's a mechanism to join unrelated messages. So order delivery we can do, and also we can indicate that certain messages are linked. So if you've ever implemented a sequential convoy in BizTalk, where you receive one message, You'll have two receive shapes in your orchestration with a listen shape around the second one. You receive the first message, and then you have a loop maybe where you're receiving lots of messages until you've completed in some way, either a certain number of messages or a timeout. And we use correlation IDs or correlation sets in BizTalk to achieve that. So sessions work the same sort of way. They're a property we set on a message. It's known as a session ID, and it indicates that to a consumer, we can specify that we want all messages with the same session ID to go to that one consumer. And that service bus will guarantee that they're delivered to that consumer in order. So if you had to link an employee and an employer message, imagine both messages had a property called employer ID, then in this case here we're using a queue. You could put a session ID, on the employer message, you set the session ID to employer ID, and then the employee message, you set the session ID to the same value, and that will link the same messages to the same session. So it means that if I created a consumer, so in Logic Apps, it's quite easy, but if you were writing it in, say, C# or something, you'd have to do this yourself. When you have a consumer connecting and reading things off the queue, you'd say, well, I want to get things that all share the same session ID. So, in a Logic App, we can say, I want this Logic App to subscribe to all messages that have a new session ID. So it will find the next unique session ID that's not currently in use, and by another Logic App, and then that Logic App will receive all those messages in order that share that same session ID. It makes more sense. So if we go to the next slide, Andrew.
Yeah. So we can look at the
diagrams are always helpful. So in this one here, concurrent demultiplexing. It's probably the biggest words I've said today, but that's exactly what they do. So if I have an interleaved message stream, so if we look in the top of this diagram here, I've got multiple messages where they're related by color in this case. So everything that's orange and a 1 is related, and everything that's 2 and a green is related, and everything that's 3 and a blue is related. So what we would like to do is say, as a consumer, so consumer 1, message session receive, I want to get all the number 1s, but they are received in order. Even though,
what we're also talking about here is each of those message session receives. Those are all instances, aren't they?
Yes.
So they're instant. It's the same app, but it's a different instance of that app, possibly.
Yes, exactly right. So we're saying in this case here, we want all number 1s to go to one consumer, all number 2s to another, all number 3s to another. And so when we start talking about certain patterns that we implement in BizTalk, this will be how we do them. So if you want to do, request response is the first one I can think of, but correlation, parallel convoy, or sequential convoy, this is how you would do it. Or if we would just want order delivery. So I've worked with quite a few clients where they've received, they know over a 5-minute period, they're going to be receiving a number of messages, and they must all be processed in order. And we use session IDs to support that. Another good question from Andy Norris, which is, should we also consider Event Hub? That is true, Andy. I didn't include that on here, but I always think of Event Hub as something for IoT, but it is a contender here. I haven't actually worked with I haven't worked with a client that wanted to use Event Hub as a pub sub, at least as a pub sub mechanism. It might be worth having a separate session at some point talking about how we would do this, implementing a simple pub sub in all 3 and showing the pros and cons. Andrew, that could actually be quite useful.
That's a great idea. So if you like that, just give us a thumbs up in the chat, and we'll see what we can do about putting that one together.
Cool. Moving on from here, one of the things to talk about next is how we deploy things. So again, most people will know about Logic Apps and deployment, but just to make sure that everyone's at the same level, when you deploy a Logic App, it's part of an ARM template. So today, at least, if I'm deploying to the portal. So an ARM template is made up of 5 different sections. You have a schema and version at the top. You have a collection of parameters to be passed in or to be defaulted in your ARM template, variables that you declare, And then you've got the resources and then the outputs. Now, a logic app sits inside an ARM template in the resources section. And at the moment, you can have one logic app per ARM template if you want to be able to open the logic app in the designer in Visual Studio Code or Visual Studio. So those are the 5 parts.
So that doesn't mean one action, does it? That doesn't mean one single action.
No,
it means a logic app that can be composed of multiple actions, but one logic app.
It's a little bit confusing because you have an ARM template, and then within the ARM template, you have a logic apps template. So they're sort of, within each other. So the logic apps, if we have a look at what's inside an ARM template and how these relate. So as an example here, you can see we've got a schema version at the top. We've got some parameters happening. There's no variables defined. And then we have some resources. And at the very top there, although it's very difficult to see on this, we've got a resource provider, who in this case here is the storage account. So this ARM template is for deploying a storage account. And the reason I wanted to talk about this is then when we look at what a logic app looks like, a logic app is made up of a collection of one trigger and multiple actions. So they all sit inside an ARM template. If you export a logic app from the portal today, you get an ARM template. And something we should talk about actually, maybe in a later session, is how we deploy logic apps. Because at the moment, the only way to deploy a logic app is via an ARM template that you start either via, you deploy it either via PowerShell or the Azure CLI. But I imagine if it's not there already, that there will be direct Azure CLI support. And it would be quite nice to see a logic app deployed where you didn't need the ARM template, you just needed the actual logic app template. I don't know if anyone on this call has signed up to the preview for logic apps running on functions that Matt Farmer announced at the Integrate conference. But if you do that, what you'll find is that the logic apps aren't inside an ARM template, it's just the logic app template. But if we move on, Andrew, what we can do is just have a quick look at what makes up a logic app. So in this case here, and again, this is logic apps 101. Every logic app has a trigger of some sort, whether that's the HTTP trigger or a connector trigger or something like that, or scheduled trigger. And then a
trigger is merely something that initiates the work, isn't it? So
yes.
So effectively in the BizTalk analogy, a receive adapter is a bit like a trigger. That's something that detects something outside and then then says, we've got work to do. Let's go and do some work.
That's exactly right, and ditto with, say, an orchestration where you have an initialize receive shape in your orchestration. That's the trigger, if you like. It's a little more complex than that because it's it's the actual port on your orchestration that's technically the trigger that defines the subscription. But if you then had an orchestration and you're using the call or start orchestration shape, you're passing parameters. There's no initialize shape on there. The orchestration just starts and it's passed in some parameters. In which case, that's your equivalent to maybe the HTTP trigger. There's no, you're not actually connecting to anything to start it. So with a logic app, the HTTP trigger or connector and the scheduler trigger or connector, they're a little bit different because they don't go anywhere to get any information. They await you to start the logic app by calling it. So the scheduler is running on a schedule, and the logic app just starts when it hits that schedule. And with the HTTP, you need to manually call the logic app by doing an HTTP post, whether that's yourself or whether it's another logic app or another service. All the other trigger connectors are generally polling. There's a few that are event-based. And in my mind, there should be a lot more. So take the Service Bus trigger, for example. If I'm subscribing to a message, the way that works is it runs on a polling cycle. So we check every, whatever you set the recurrence frequency to, 30 seconds to see if there's any new messages on the subscription. And then if there are, then the logic app executes.
Yeah, and that's like the example we've just done, because we've done the receive side, which has got a file trigger that's pulling in and publishing on the Service Bus in our example. But then the send side still has to have a trigger, but that trigger is coming off the equivalent of the message box.
Yes, exactly.
Coming off the Service Bus, but it's still a trigger because that's what's initiating a new piece of work to actually start.
Yes, very much so. And in fact, it's an interesting pattern because event grid, you'd think the first time I used the Service Bus connector for triggering a logic app, I couldn't work out why it was polling, because in my mind it's like, well, it's an event. Why am I polling, and why am I paying for each poll action here? So when Event Grid was released and we started having Event Grid connectors, it occurred to me that it's like, well, why do we need to poll? Why can't I use Event Grid and have my logic app triggered when a message is in a subscription? So can't I use a custom topic in Event Grid and have my logic app triggered then? So I don't know. These are questions for Microsoft really, in terms of why we can't use Event Grid under the covers with the Service Bus connectors, so that we don't have to poll. Because that would make it, to me at least, it would mean that you get rid of the whole need for a polling cycle.
Yeah, because it becomes a push then rather than a pull.
Exactly.
So we're actually just making, because what you really want is, for serverless work, you only want the whole point of serverless is that you're only doing work when work needs to be done. And the problem with polling is that you're continually doing work, even if there isn't any. And so the fact that you can use events means that you can actually be properly take the advantage of serverless, that you literally don't pay for anything until there is work to do. Which polling currently doesn't give you. So let's move on though, because we've got this slide here, which is the sort of a bit more abstract about triggers and actions. And what we've done is we've made this, and so this is that BizTalk example that we looked at just before, and that we're breaking this down into actual logic apps. So do you want to talk us through this one, Dan?
Sure. So this is just one example of how you could do this. There's multiple ways you could do it, but let's say I wanted to take like for like. I wanted to take exactly what I've got in BizTalk and recreate it in logic apps. This would be probably the starting approach I'd go with. So if you're using the file system connector, because I want to read to a local file, today we have to use the on-premise data gateway. You could use the Azure file connector to go to a file storage, but for most people, when they're recreating something they have in BizTalk in logic apps, they have a file share. I want to pick up a file from a file share. So the on-premise data gateway, if you're not familiar with it, is a service that you install somewhere on an on-premises server, and it uses Azure Service Bus Relay to effectively do a reverse proxy. So instead of you having to open holes in your firewall to allow connections in, it makes a connection out to a Service Bus instance up in the cloud looking for work, and it opens a long-running transaction on that, waiting for work to be present, and when there's work, it receives it, executes it, gets the results, and publishes those back up to the Service Bus instance. So it's all seamlessly done for you. So,
but do you need that even if you've kind of got your cloud infrastructure in a VNet that's VPN'd into your on-prem?
Today, yes. So there's talk about a file connector that wouldn't need to use on-premise data gateway. I know that at least in the early days, if you wanted to do this sort of scenario and you were entirely in the cloud, so I had a VM sitting inside a virtual network that had a file share on it. Maybe it's running. Say you were running some sort of Oracle database processing on a VM, an old application, a legacy application of some sort, and it's outputting files. In order to read those into the logic app through the file system connector, you'd have to put on-premise data gateway on your VM, which kind of seems, given that that VM is in Azure, kind of seemed a bit odd. But today it's still the way. You can still use the on-premise data gateway across Express Route or VPN. That's probably more complex than we need to talk about today. It's increasing in use, and from at least it's becoming more and more feature rich. It's originally written by the Power BI team for use by Power BI. It's now extended out to sort of Azure Automate and Power Automate and Power Apps and Logic Apps and Power BI. It's quite a cool technology, but it's just something to bear in mind that it's an extra thing that you need. If you want to use the file system connector in a Logic app, you need on-premise data gateway. The connector asks you what gateway instance you're going to use. But if we continue talking about the ZAP,
okay. So what we've got here, and like I say, for those of you watching in black and white, the the flat file decode is the one above the XML transform. But yeah, but what we've got here is the back to the whole thing we're talking about with the ARM template, that we've got one logic app, but within that you can still have multiple actions that are going on.
Yes, very much so. So we're recreating what the pipeline does.
Yeah. So what's happening with these actions then?
Well, so the flat file decode action is a built-in action. It connects to an integration account, and you take your BizTalk flat file schema. In fact, if you have ever used the integration tools, although I think they're still stuck on Visual Studio 2015, I can't remember. I don't think they've upgraded them late, to support BizTalk 2020. But the actual tools that you use are the BizTalk tools. You're creating a flat file using the same tools you'd be using a BizTalk. In fact, you can just use a BizTalk flat file schema if you want. So you upload that to your integration account, and then the flat file decode action can take in a flat file body, if you like, from somewhere, in which case it's from the file system connector trigger. And we're passing that to the flat file decode action, which returns us some XML. Then the XML transform action, again, is very similar. You need an integration account, so you upload your maps as XSLT. Now, this is something that is a little bit different. You can't take your BTM file from BizTalk. You actually have to pull out the XSLT. There's in the integration tooling, the Enterprise Integration Pack, I think it's called. There's a tool that does that for you.
Yeah, because when you compile a BTM, it actually does have that schema literally compiled into the assembly, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. It converts your BTM to XSLT. Obviously, if you're using a custom XSLT, then that's in there anyway. But yes, this is what this tool does. It pulls out that XSLT for you, so you can upload it to the integration account. So you upload that, and then the transform action executes the XSLT. It's important to note that the transform action also supports liquid templates as well. Not much use in BizTalk, but liquid as a language for doing transforms is interesting because API management uses it. So, for example, if you're doing SOAP to REST, that's something we could have a whole session on API management. But if you have some existing, WCF endpoints that are using SOAP, and you want to convert those to REST, then APIM can do that for you. And what it does is it looks at the WSDL and auto generates a liquid template to convert from the XML to JSON, and then from JSON back to XML as well. It's quite cool, quite funky.
Yes, so Liquid's a really kind of interesting thing because it came out of wasn't it Shopify that came out with Liquid?
Indeed, yes.
Because basically that was how they built themes for online shops in Shopify.
Yep.
Was using like a language called Liquid, but then obviously it was so useful. It's like everyone else thought, well, that XSLT is a bit rubbish. Let's use yes. And it's really hard to read and it's really difficult to understand. Let's use Liquid. So
exactly,
Liquid's.
Yep.
So if you come from a past of XSLT, then look at the future because it's Liquid. It's probably a good place to look.
There's quite a few technologies like that started somewhere else. I mean, JSON's a classic example. There's JavaScript object notification, notation. Started in JavaScript. Now everyone's using it.
In fact, if you only started programming in the last, I don't know, maybe not 10 years, but certainly the last 5 years, you've probably never done XML. Literally just like XML, what's this? That's what my granddad used to use. It's all JSON now.
I love the fact that even in BizTalk, Andrew, even in BizTalk, the JSON support exists to convert JSON to XML because that's what BizTalk knows, XML through and through. But it's no different. Logic apps. One of the things we didn't really sort of talk about is that logic apps are JSON through and through. So even if
natively, that's what they do.
Yeah, each action, I mean, we could talk about the logic app execution engine, but each action in a logic app has inputs and outputs, and they're represented in JSON. So everything is based upon the content type of what you supply, either to your trigger or to an action, especially if the action is a connector action that's going out. So if for example, the XML transform, if you execute the XML transform action, the output of that is going to be a JSON object. And in there, you're going to find the content type, which will be application/XML, and the XML, which will be in base 64 form. because of course you can't put XML directly into a JSON message. So the Logic Apps engine is smart enough to automatically recognize that the XML transform's returning you XML, so it wraps it for you so that it doesn't break the JSON you've got. But that's sort of a trick for new players. When you're using the output of your XML transform and expecting to have just XML, you haven't. You've got a JSON object you've got to pass.
You've got JSON object, and one of the fields is a base64 encoded piece of XML.
Exactly right. Yeah. So then we go to the Service Bus published action. So this is something that in BizTalk you don't see. So if you've just created a receive port and a receive location, the whole pipeline there is going to automatically publish to the message box. You don't have a choice as to where it goes. But in our case here, we've decided we're using Service Bus in this example, so we are publishing to a Service Bus topic.
Yep. Yeah, because normally that's what in BizTalk, that's what the adapter would do for you.
Yes.
But then again, you don't have a choice because BizTalk always publishes the message box.
Yes, exactly. Right.
Whereas in a Logic app, you actually don't have to do PubSub, but we're talking about PubSub in this sense because we're trying to sort of look at what a BizTalk app would look like in AIS. But you don't have to use them. You don't have to use PubSub.
No, exactly right. You don't have to. You've got choices. But if you're trying to, recreate exactly what BizTalks do faithfully, then yes, just like you probably would have a single topic representing the message box as well, because everyone subscribes off one message box, even though you split it. Anyway, so then if we look at the other side, now we're looking at the send port side. You'd have a Service Bus topic trigger. So that is triggering off subscriptions in that Service Bus topic, and it will be receiving XML content. Now, an interesting trick for new players is that Service Bus base64 encodes the content of the messages automatically. So whatever content you're publishing to Service Bus is going to be base64 encoded. So in your Logic app, if you reference that content using the smart tags in your Logic app, the designer automatically adds in a little base64 to string expression for you magically, so you don't have to think about it. But if you have a look at the code behind the code view, what you get out of Service Bus is always base64 encoded, because it doesn't know what you're going to give it. It could be a binary file, for example. Yeah. And then if you think about how send ports and receive ports work, transforms on a receive port are done at the end. Transforms on a send port are done at the beginning. So so
basically they're a mirror of each other.
Exactly right. So in this case here, our Logic app's going to use the XML transform, which works the same sort of way. We transform what we got off the Service Bus topic. Then we do a flat file encode, which again uses a flat file schema from your integration accounts. Yes, both of these things do need an integration account. You can use the free integration account, which has support for what I think it's about 50 schemas and maps. And yes, there is a cost if you want to use more than that. And then we go to the file system connector, which again uses on-premise data gateway and publishes out to a file. So this would be a simple way of representing that BizTalk application in AIS.
So that's a fantastic overview, Dan, of what a BizTalk application would look like. I'm conscious of the fact that we are nearly at the end of time now, so yes. We'll kind of wrap up there for the moment. But we've got kind of a bit of a recap on the main thing. So, in our opinion, and in particular, me deferring to the expert I have alongside me, Service Bus is the best choice for PubSub, especially if you need correlation in order delivery. Event Grid is a good choice if you need messages, larger messages, because you can squeeze that up to 1 meg. But really, if you're dealing with large messages, then you're probably going to be using the claim check pattern and putting it in blob storage, putting the actual message in blob storage and the metadata about that message either on Event Grid or on Service Bus. Looking at what Andy said, it's also we're going to look at we'll have a think about Event Hub as well and where that fits in. So in Logic apps, one of the things is that you get a Logic app can contain contains triggers and actions, and a trigger is actually a special sort of action. But you get charged for every action, not for every logic app. So that's kind of the interesting thing about the cost model there. That if you make a logic app with 100 actions, or you make 100 logic apps with one action that all sort of link together, it's the same cost. So so there's no brownie points for making a big monolithic logic app. Ultimately, don't go down that route, because it's not going to save you. It's just, you're just going to end up with an unmaintainable big thing. The other thing is that, I mean, logic apps aren't compiled in that way, but once you create a logic app, you can't change the trigger. So it's not like in BizTalk where you can change the receive, you can add a different receive location onto a receive port and you don't have to change anything else. Or once a logic app's created, you can't change the trigger, because even though these things aren't compiled, they're deployed as a thing that chains together. And so, and when that's deployed, that configuration is set until you redeploy. So if you want to change from file to FTP, you have to redeploy. I mean, it's not a big change code-wise, but you can't just do it on the fly. But as with all cloud stuff, I mean, in a cloud mentality, we're very used now to thinking tear down and redeploy anyway. This whole thing of I'll stand this up and I'll tweak it while it's in flight. I mean, just don't do that. It's just, redeploying is good, because that means that you're at a known state. And we said logic apps, everything's a trigger or action, and definitely consider, like we were saying before, don't just make one humongous logic app that does your entire business process. Split it into smaller logic apps. Just use the microservices approach, because logic apps themselves can be made are effectively microservices, and you should split them into testable units that are small enough to handle and be tested and redeployed. Because again, if you've got a logic app with 100 different bits, but you only need to change the first one, if you split them, you only need to redeploy that first one. The rest of them. Exactly
right. The testing is really important, Andrew, because if you think about testing BizTalk, if I've got this scenario I wanted to test, I can only test it by dropping a file in. Whereas if I split that sample logic app we had earlier, we didn't get time to talk about this, but if you split that logic app into smaller pieces, so that you're receiving the file in one logic app, and then maybe you're doing the decode and transform and publish in another logic app, and you're using, say, the HTTP connector in the second logic app, then I can test that logic app in isolation. I don't have to connect it up to the file part. I can test that and make sure it works. So it's because there's no additional cost. I mean, you might have an extra action in each logic app, but there's no huge cost in terms of having more logic apps. You should definitely think about splitting up your logic apps.
So the only extra action is that trigger at the start that you might need an extra.
Exactly.
Great. Okay. So I'd like to thank you, Dan, for putting an amazing presentation together on that. I think we've actually been through our Q&A at the moment, but as I say, keep them coming. Anything else, just pop it in the Q&A, and we'll get through to that. Now, if you want to get involved, let us know. Here's the details for Valerie at Microsoft, who is the valerie.rob@microsoft.com. Valerie is the senior program manager for BizTalk, and is actively looking for companies to take part in a private preview for BizTalk Migrator, and so you're welcome to get in touch with if you've got a project that wants to migrate from BizTalk to AIS using Microsoft's new tooling before it's released. And next webinar, so what we're going to do, so we've kind of talked again another layer down, and we're going to actually hit the bare metal next time. We're going to what we're going to do is we're going to take our life in our own hands, and we're going to do building logic apps live. What could go wrong? Nothing. Don't work with animals, children, or logic apps is the mantra for webinars. But in a couple of weeks' time, we will build some logic apps live and literally go through wiring these things together a bit of see if we can get them running, get them tested through Postman and that sort of thing. We'll do a bit of that next time. So that will be a great webinar. So I say always willing to share information. Me and Dan, here's our contact details. Hit us up on LinkedIn, send us an email. Love to hear from you. And for us, that is the. I think we're just about on time. I'd like to thank you all for attending. We will post the recording of the webinar for you over the next few days. And thanks a lot for attending. It's been great having you along. And we'll see you soon. Okay, George.
Thank you very much. Cheers. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
All right. Thanks, Dan. And we'll see you next time. Okay.
Will do.
All right. Thanks a lot. Bye now.